Long before any captain raised a sail, before the first compass was carved, or the first island charted, the ocean held within it a memory that no living person could fully name. There was an age when the world breathed at a different pace, when civilizations rose and left their fingerprints on stone, on sky, and on the deep floor of the sea, and the names of those who built them dissolved into centuries like salt into water. Tonight, we trace that world from its very first breath, and if these quiet stories help you rest, please feel free to subscribe for more calm One Piece journeys, and let the oldest chapter of all carry you gently towards sleep. Beginning 5,000 years ago, on an island full of people who believed nothing should ever truly be forgotten. 5,000 years before the era in which Monkey D. Luffy set sail from the shores of Fuchsia Village, a tree was planted on an island called O'Hara. It was not planted casually or without intention. The ancient people of O'Hara were a civilization devoted entirely to the gathering and preservation of knowledge, a people who understood that the most fragile thing in any world is the truth, and that the only way to protect it is to write it down and tend to it the way you would tend to anything living. The tree they planted grew slowly in the way of ancient things. It pushed its roots deep into the island's soil and stretched its branches outward across decades, then centuries, then millennia, until it became something vast and sheltering, not merely a tree at all, but a library, a place where scholars could wade into the water at its roots and reach upward toward branches heavy with everything that had ever been written, everything that had ever been known, everything that a long line of devoted people had refused to let disappear. This was the Tree of Knowledge, and it stood as the oldest continuous act of memory in the entire One Piece world. The scholars of O'Hara understood, even in those earliest centuries, that the universe they were cataloging was older than their own civilization by a breathtaking margin. They read stones and fragments and pieces of a world that had already passed through ages they could barely imagine. They studied the poneglyphs, those massive, indestructible tablets carved with writing in a language so old that almost no one in the present era could read it. They dedicated their lives to a question that had no comfortable answer. What had actually happened, and why had so much of it been hidden? That question would follow O'Hara across 5,000 years, right up until the day the world government decided the island needed to be erased entirely. 1,000 years after that first tree was planted, 4,000 years before the present day, in the kingdom of Alabarna, a great palace was built. It rose from the desert in the precise, considered way of a civilization that intended to last. The palace of Alabarna was not built for any single king or queen. It was built as a permanent center, a declaration in stone and architecture that a people had chosen this land and meant to remain. Whoever they were, whatever language they spoke beside their fires at night, whatever festivals they observed when the rains finally came, they left behind a structure that would endure for 4,000 years before anyone in the current story would stand beneath its arches and begin to understand what it meant. The connection between Alabarna and the ancient world would resurface much later in fragments and half-truths and carved messages that pointed toward things no one was supposed to look for. There was a poneglyph buried beneath the royal tomb in Alabarna that a man named Crocodile spent years trying to locate, believing it would lead him to the ancient weapon Pluton. When that poneglyph was finally read, the information it held was not what Crocodile expected. But the fact that the poneglyph was there at all, that the Kozuki family had placed a carved stone in the foundation of that ancient desert kingdom, told its own quiet story about how deep the connections between the old world and the present one actually ran. 1,000 years after Alabarna, 3,000 years before the present story, something was built on Elbaf. The island of the giants, home of the great northern warriors, has always been one of the oldest and most permanent places in the One Piece world. The giants of Elbaf measure their years differently than other peoples do. They live long lives by any standard, and their culture reflects that longevity, careful, tradition-bound, deeply aware of the weight of the past. What was constructed on Elbaf 3,000 years ago was a facility whose precise function has not been fully described in any records still available. But its existence confirms something important. Elbaf was not simply a kingdom of warriors and festivals in those ancient times. It was also a place of building, of deliberate purpose, of a people investing in structures whose meaning was meant to outlast any single generation. The giants of Elbaf have been present in some form or another at nearly every significant juncture in the One Piece world's history. Their size and their longevity give them a perspective that other peoples simply do not have access to. An elder giant who was already old in the era of Gol D. Roger would have been a young adult during the time of the Rocks pirates, a child during the events that preceded the Great Pirate Era, and perhaps not yet born during the centuries when Noland of Livneal walked the earth. The giants of Elbaf carry within their culture a living memory that stretches back in ways no written record can fully replicate. Roughly 1,500 years before the present day, an era of calendars and counting began, or perhaps ended. What historians can reconstruct with reasonable confidence is that the age of the sea circle, the calendar system found in the logbook of Mont Blanc Noland, the explorer from Livneal, began its count somewhere around this period. The existence of this calendar is itself significant in a quiet way. A calendar requires not just civilization, but coordination. It requires enough interconnection between communities that a shared system of marking time becomes useful. Someone, somewhere in the world, had decided that the years needed to be counted together, that there was a reason for everyone to agree on when things had happened and in what order. That kind of agreement is an act of civilization in the deepest sense. The age of the sea circle tells us that the world, 1,500 years before the present, was connected enough to require a shared language of time. Nolan's logbook, written 400 years ago, carried a date reading the year 1120 in the sea circle calendar. Working backward from that entry, scholars can estimate when the calendar began and what that means for the broader timeline. Noland himself did not know he was providing one of the clearest temporal anchors available to anyone trying to understand the One Piece world's chronology. He was simply writing in his journal the way careful explorers do, describing what he had seen and when he had seen it, in the hope that someone who came after him would find the record and understand. 1,100 years before the present day, one of the most extraordinary cities in all of One Piece history was alive and prospering. On an island called Jaya, or rather on the landmass that would later become part of what was known as Jaya, a civilization called Shandora had reached the fullness of its greatness. Shandora was not simply a large city, it was a city with a sacred purpose, a city that understood itself to be a guardian of something that could not be guarded by walls or armies alone, only by vigilance and faith and the willingness to spend generations doing something that no individual would see the completion of. The golden towers of Shandora were not merely decorative, they were a declaration. They rose above the jungle canopy in a way that travelers passing by at sea could see from a great distance, and what they communicated was not wealth or power in the ordinary political sense, but something older and more considered. Shandora was the city that housed a poneglyph. It was one of the great carved stones that the Kazuki family had created, and it held within its inscribed surface a message meant for someone who had not yet been born. The Shandorans knew this. They did not fully know what the message said, or who would eventually come to read it. They only knew that it was their responsibility to be there when that person arrived. The warriors of Shandora were among the finest in the world. Their fighting style, the ways of the Shandians, was built around the idea of protection, the absolute refusal to let the thing in their care be taken or destroyed. For generations, they stood beside the golden bell and the carved stone beneath it, living their lives and raising their children and fighting when they needed to fight, all in service of a vigil that stretched across centuries. The fact that Shandora was eventually launched into the sky ripped from its island by a geological event of catastrophic force, and sent spinning upward to become part of the floating island known as Skypiea, did not end the vigil. The Shandians simply continued it 5,000 meters above the ocean's surface, in the middle of clouds, in a world that most people on the surface below did not even know existed. Around 1,000 years before the present day, a creature was born that would carry an entire civilization on its back for a millennium and beyond. Zunisha was not simply a large elephant. Zunisha was, and remains, one of the oldest living beings in the One Piece world, an enormous island elephant whose body is so massive that a thriving civilization of thousands of people has made their home on its back without Zunisha being particularly burdened by the weight. The earliest known sighting of Zunisha dates to approximately 1,000 years ago, and around the same time, a community known as the Mink tribe made a decision that would define their entire future. The Mink tribe are a people of humanoid animals, beings who walk upright, speak, form societies, and possess the ability to produce electrical energy from their bodies in their most powerful combat form. They are ancient and proud and intensely protective of those they consider family. 1,000 years ago, for reasons connected to the great upheavals that were reshaping the world at that time, the Mink tribe withdrew from the wider world and took up residence on the back of Zanisha. They called their nation Zo, and they lived there in deliberate isolation, riding the giant elephant across the floor of the ocean and through whatever other territory Zunisha chose to traverse, sealed off from the political world below and above by a wall of deliberate distance. The isolation of the Mink tribe on Zu was connected, though not in ways anyone could have predicted at the time, to the secrets that would bring the Straw Hat Pirates to that same floating island over 1,000 years later. The Minks knew things they had kept since the Void Century. Things about a samurai, about a hidden connection to the Kozuki clan, about a plan that stretched across 2 decades and needed exactly the right people to arrive at exactly the right time. Also during this era, a feud began between two ancient peoples that would echo forward through 1,000 years of history. The Long-Armed Tribe and the Long-Leg Tribe, distinguished from one another and from most other peoples by the dramatic proportions of their bodies, entered into a conflict whose origins have been absorbed entirely into the past. No record names the specific insult or the specific incident that ignited the quarrel. What survived was the quarrel itself, the bone-deep sense of grievance that neither side could release, that neither side fully understood anymore by the time the present story began, but that both sides continued to carry with the tenacity of something inherited rather than chosen. The Long-Leg Tribe, consumed by a desire for revenge so intense that it could not be satisfied by any ordinary means, sought a solution that no ordinary person would have considered. They offered their immortal souls in exchange for power enough to even the score. The force that was called to answer this offer was something ancient and inexplicable. And the being that eventually manifested from this arrangement was a skeleton musician named Brooke, who had been sailing the Florian Triangle alone for 50 years by the time the Straw Hats found him, kept alive by the revive fruit, bound by the memory of a promise and the thread of a bargain that neither he nor the people who made it had fully understood. 900 years before the present day, the world stood at a crossroads so significant that even the people who were alive to watch it happen could not have fully grasped the scale of what was occurring. A great civilization, the most powerful, the most interconnected, the most ambitious that the world had ever produced, was at its absolute zenith. This was not one kingdom or one empire. It was something larger and stranger than that. A network of peoples and nations stretching from one end of the known world to the other, connected by a shared understanding and perhaps by a shared dream of what the world could be and what it owed to the people living in it. The civilization of that era built things that have not been replicated in the 900 years since. The breadth of their engineering, the sophistication of their agriculture and their ships and their weapons suggests a world functioning at a level that the post-Void Century order never managed to recover. The world government, with all its resources and all its centuries of accumulated authority, was still in the present day, not entirely sure what some of the technology of the ancient world actually was or how it worked. The blueprints for Pluton, one of the three ancient weapons, had been copied and studied and debated for generations by the best minds available to the Marines. And the cipher pole, and still the full scope of what the ancient builders had created, remained partially obscure. The Don Quixote family, which in the present day is associated primarily with one of the most despicable warlords in living memory, had a much older history than any of their current members seemed eager to acknowledge. 900 years before the present, the Don Quixote family was among those who persecuted the Tanada people, the dwarves of Tontada, in a campaign whose specific contours have been lost to time, but whose consequences the dwarves of Dressrosa still carried in their bones and their history. The dwarves' almost limitless faith in the honesty of others and their intense loyalty to those who showed them kindness were character traits forged in the experience of having been mistreated by those who should have protected them. The Don Quixote family's later crimes in Dressrosa, in the present timeline, were in this sense a continuation of something that had begun 900 years earlier. It was during this era of 900 years ago, in the opening phase of what would later be called the Void Century, that a man appeared who was unlike anyone else in the world. He had eaten a devil fruit, the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, and the power it gave him was not simply physical transformation. It was a quality of being, a relationship with freedom itself, a way of moving through the world that refused every boundary the world tried to draw. The sun god Nika was a figure from mythology, not a god in any temple, but a dream, an idea that the world's most oppressed peoples had kept alive in story and in prayer, the belief that someone would eventually come who moved so freely and laughed so completely that even the heaviest chains could not hold him. This man, who took the name Joy Boy, became the first pirate in history. Not simply an outlaw or a sailor who robbed other ships, a pirate in the truest sense. Someone who recognized no authority above the freedom of the open sea, who sailed where the world told him he couldn't, who made promises based on love rather than power and kept them, or tried to, with everything he had. Joy Boy was not a simple figure. He was not simply a hero in the clean, unambiguous way that children's stories require. He was a man with enormous power, enormous will, and an enormous sense of responsibility toward the people he cared about, who also, in the end, failed to do something he had promised he would do. That failure, and the sincere apology he left carved into stone, would define the texture of the next 800 years in ways neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The civilization of Joy Boy's era built three weapons of such staggering destructive capacity that their existence alone was enough to reshape the entire political order of the world, both in the era when they were made and in every century that followed. These were Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, the ancient weapons, each of them capable individually of affecting the world on a geological scale. Pluton was a battleship, or at least that was the name given to it, though the word battleship implies something much smaller and more ordinary than what the ancient builders had actually created. A vessel of sufficient size and destructive power that the world government spent centuries looking for its location and its blueprints, never quite assembling the complete picture. Poseidon was different from the other two in one fundamental way. It was not a constructed object. Poseidon was a living being. Specifically, it was a title given to a mermaid princess who was born with the ability to speak with and command the ancient sea kings, the enormous serpentine creatures of the deep ocean, whose bodies stretched for miles and whose movements could affect the currents of the entire world. The sea kings, for all their physical enormity, were not simply animals. They were beings of ancient intelligence, connected to something older and stranger than ordinary biology, and a person who could speak with them and direct their movements held within their hands a power that no fleet of warships could match. Uranus has never been fully revealed. Its nature, its location, its appearance, All of these remain among the deepest secrets in the current era of One Piece. What is known is that it existed, that it was real, and that the world government feared it as much as it feared the other two. The existence of three weapons at such scale was not an accident of the ancient civilization's ambitions. They were built deliberately with a specific purpose, and the fact that they were built at all tells us something about the stakes of the conflict that was coming. When you build weapons that can reshape the world, you are preparing for a fight that has the potential to end everything. Joy Boy had a specific and deeply personal connection to Poseidon. The mermaid who carried the power in Joy Boy's time was the ruler or a member of the royal family of Fishman Island, the kingdom at the ocean floor at the base of the Red Line. And between Joy Boy and this person, a partnership had been established. Together, they had been working on something that had never been done before, the ship called Noah, an ark in the truest sense of the word, enormous beyond any ordinary vessel, built to carry an entire people, had been constructed in the depths of the sea near Fishman Island and was awaiting the moment when Poseidon's power would be used to raise it to the surface. The plan was for Joy Boy, working with Poseidon, to bring all of the people of Fishman Island up to the surface world. The dream of the fish folk had always been to leave the darkness of the ocean floor and live in the sunlight that filtered down from above but never quite reached them. Joy Boy had made a formal promise, the kind carved into stone, the kind that carries the full weight of a person's integrity, that he would be the one to fulfill that dream. He and Poseidon together would raise Noah and bring the people of Fishman Island up into the open air. The attempt failed. The reasons have not been fully explained in any poneglyph that has been found and read. What is known is that something went wrong, something that Joy Boy could not overcome, some obstacle or some limitation that was beyond even his considerable abilities at that specific moment in the world's history. Noah was not raised. The people of Fishman Island remained at the ocean floor, and Joy Boy, understanding the weight of what he had failed to do, left behind an apology. The stone poneglyph at Fishman Island carries his words, a simple, sincere, heartbroken acknowledgement that he had broken his promise and a statement of faith that someday someone else would come who could do what he had been unable to. That apology sat on the ocean floor, undisturbed and mostly unread, for 800 years. During the same era, a construction of extraordinary ambition was completed in a location that future generations would not be able to fully identify. The Iron Giant, later known by the name Emeth, was built by the craftspeople of the ancient civilization, and it was built for a purpose that went far beyond any single battle or campaign. Emeth was enormous. It was taller than buildings, denser than ordinary materials, constructed from a kind of metal that would resist corrosion and physical damage across centuries of dormancy. And Emeth was not simply a weapon or a tool. It was something closer to a servant, built with the capacity to wait, to remain inactive across spans of time that would exhaust any human mind, and to resume its function when the specific conditions that activated it were finally met. Emeth lay dormant for most of the centuries following the Void Century. It slept in the ocean or in ruins, while kingdoms rose and fell around it, while pirates sailed over it, while marine fleets passed through the waters nearby without any awareness of what was waiting beneath them. But the energy that had been built into Emeth, the intention, the programming, the specific loyalty that its creators had instilled in it, never dissipated. When the events of Egghead Island eventually caused the conditions for its activation to be met, Emeth moved again, for the first time in 800 years, and the brief moments of its reactivation told everyone watching that the ancient world had thought further ahead than even the most optimistic scholar had estimated. 830 years before the present day, a woman was born in Wano who would carry time itself in her hands. Her name was Toki, and she was a member of the Kozuki clan, the family that would become inseparable from the history of the poneglyphs, from the history of the Void Century, and from the long chain of events leading directly to the current story. Toki had eaten the Toki Toki no Mi, a devil fruit They gave her the ability to send herself and others forward through time. She could not travel backward. The past was closed to her in the same way it is closed to everyone. But the future was accessible, and she could move through it in directed jumps, arriving wherever the arc of time carried her. The fact that Toki was born during the Void Century, that the Kozuki clan was active and present during those 100 years that the world government wanted no one to know about, is one of the most significant connecting threads in all of One Piece. Wano is not simply an isolated nation that happened to close its borders at some point in the distant past. Wano's isolation is directly connected to the secrets its founding family carried. The Kozuki clan were the ones who built the poneglyphs. They were the ones who inscribed the truth of the Void Century into indestructible stone. And so they were, from the moment the world government formed, a target, a family whose complete knowledge was the single most dangerous thing in the world to those who were determined to maintain the silence. And now we arrive at the thing that shadows every conversation about One Piece history, the event that every poneglyph points toward, every mystery circles around, every act of censorship in the centuries that followed was designed to conceal. The Void Century. 100 years of history, 900 years to 800 years before the present day, that were deliberately and systematically removed from the world's written record. The Void Century began with Joy Boy's civilization at its height, with ancient weapons operating and Noah waiting to be raised, and the great network of peoples living in relative connection across the world. It ended with most of that civilization gone, the world remade, and a new order installed in its place. The 20 royal families who formed the alliance against Joy Boy's civilization did not come from nowhere. Each of them ruled a kingdom. Each of them had their own reasons for seeing the great civilization as a threat, and each of them contributed something to the war effort. Whether their motivations were genuine fear, political calculation, envy, or some ideology about what the world should look like, those motivations have been buried as completely as the history of the war itself. What remains are the consequences, and the consequences lasted 800 years and are still shaping the world in the present timeline. The war that ended the Void Century was catastrophic. Shandora, that golden city that had stood for over 1,000 years and had survived everything the world had thrown at it, was destroyed. The destruction of Shandora was not simply the end of a city, it was the end of an era, the silencing of one of the most steadfast acts of cultural memory in the history of the One Piece world. The Shandorans had guarded their poneglyph across generations, refusing to be dislodged from their vigil by anything. In the end, the Great War dislodged them from the earth itself. Shandora was launched skyward by geological forces connected to the ancient weapons, and what had been a jungle city on the surface of the ocean became, over centuries, the ruins of a civilization floating in clouds above the world's memory. Joy Boy was defeated. The 20 royal families won. The great civilization that had stretched from one end of the world to the other was broken, scattered, and suppressed. And in the immediate aftermath of that victory, Joy Boy did what the record suggests he had done with every important promise he ever made. He found a place to leave something behind. He sailed to the final island at the end of the Grand Line, the island that would eventually be called Laugh Tale, and he stored there the thing that would later be called the One Piece. The nature of the One Piece remains the deepest secret in the current story. Only those who have reached Laugh Tale and gathered all 4 road poneglyphs and survived the entire length of the Grand Line know what it actually is. But Joy Boy left it there, with the full faith that someone would eventually come who understood what it meant and what to do with it. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm One Piece stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The sea changed in the immediate aftermath of the Void Century in a way that could not be hidden or revised or edited into obscurity. The ocean rose by 200 meters, 200 meters of new water, covering everything that had existed below that line, every low-lying coastline, every island that didn't have the elevation to survive the shift, every harbor and fishing village, and small kingdom that had been built at sea level and could not move fast enough to adapt. The geological event that caused this rise was connected to the use of the ancient weapons, to the catastrophic scale of the war that had just ended. The planet had absorbed the impact of the conflict and shifted accordingly, and the new ocean was the most visible and permanent consequence. The red line, the great continuous ridge of stone that wraps around the entire world, remained above the new waterline. It was the highest terrain available, and the 20 royal families, who understood what was coming, or who had perhaps contributed to causing it, had already positioned themselves at its peak. Marineford, the Holy Land, stood at the summit of the red line, above the reach of even the risen ocean, and the 20 kings gathered there and called it home. There had been others living at those heights before them. The Lunarians, a people of extraordinary physical power, capable of generating fire from their own bodies, who had inhabited the upper reaches of the red line before anyone else arrived, were displaced. What happened to the Lunarians in the centuries that followed became one of the great unspoken atrocities of the post-void century world. They were hunted until almost none remained. The last known survivor in the current era was a man named King, who served as Kaido's strongest commander in Wano, and who carried within him the memory of an entire people's extinction. The 20 royal families settled into Marineford and made it sacred. They called themselves the Celestial Dragons, the world's nobility, above ordinary law, beyond ordinary accountability, possessing privileges so absolute that even the most powerful pirates in the present era approached them with caution. They built the world government around their authority, a political structure that would eventually encompass almost every kingdom on the planet, enforced by the Marines and their 3 admirals, administered through the Cipher Pole agencies, and theoretically governed by the Reverie, the great international council that met every few years and gave the appearance of collective decision-making, while the real power remained exactly where it had always been. The poneglyphs were built in this era by the Kozuki family. The great stone tablets, carved with an indestructible writing in the Kozuki script, were placed in locations across the world, some in the keeping of communities who understood what they held, some in ruins, some in places that would not be discovered for centuries. The poneglyphs served 2 purposes simultaneously. They were a record of what had happened, a testimony to the truth of the void century that could not be burned or revised or confiscated. And they were a map, a distributed set of directions, requiring all 4 of the special road poneglyphs to be gathered and read together, pointing toward Laughtail and toward the One Piece that waited there. The world government responded to the existence of the poneglyphs by making them illegal. Not just illegal to read, illegal to approach with scholarly intent, illegal to discuss in any context that suggested they contained historical truth. The language of the Kozuki script was outlawed worldwide. Any scholar who attempted to learn it or translate it was subject to the full force of the world government's authority, up to and including the complete military destruction of their entire community. This was not a threat made once and then forgotten. The Buster Call that destroyed O'Hara 5,000 years after its scholars had first planted the Tree of Knowledge was the world government's direct enforcement of this policy. And it came with the specific goal of killing the last person alive who could read what the stones actually said. The world that emerged from the void century was not the world that had existed before it. Every map was different. Every coastline had shifted. The 4 great seas, the East Blue, the West Blue, the North Blue, and the South Blue, were the products of a remapped planet, divided from each other and from the Grand Line by the geometry of the Red Line and the turbulent strip of ocean that ran around the world's middle. The Grand Line was not simply dangerous in the ordinary way of rough weather and difficult navigation. It was dangerous in the way of magnetic fields that made ordinary compasses useless, of weather patterns that changed with no reference to any natural rule, of islands that existed on the edge of physical possibility. Only a log pose, a compass that recorded and locked onto each island's specific magnetic signature in sequence, could guide a ship through the Grand Line with any reliability. Without one, the sailor was simply hoping. The Grand Line was also divided by the Red Line itself into two halves. The first half began at the entrance called Reverse Mountain, where the ocean's current actually flowed upward against gravity and carried ships from the Four Blues up into the Grand Line. The second half lay beyond Fishman Island, the kingdom at the ocean floor, and was called the New World. The New World was where the world's strongest people had settled. The Yonko, the four emperors, each commanded territories in the New World, and their power was so absolute that even the world government preferred to maintain a balance with them rather than attempt direct confrontation. The New World was the end of the road, the place where every pirate who intended to reach Laugh-Tale eventually had to go, and the place where most of them stopped. Fishman Island, in the centuries following the Void Century, continued to exist at the bottom of the ocean. It was a kingdom of extraordinary natural beauty, bioluminescent fish, and coral formations of every color. Enormous caverns filled with light that filtered down from the surface. A population of fishmen and merfolk who were among the most physically powerful beings in the world, and also among the most artistically and culturally sophisticated. The relationship between Fishman Island and the surface world was complicated by something that 8 centuries of world government authority had not managed to resolve: prejudice. The fish folk, despite their strength and their ancient lineage, were regarded by much of the surface world as lesser beings. The trafficking of fish folk as slaves by the celestial dragons was legal under world government authority, and would remain so until the Straw Hat Pirates' actions at Subodi Archipelago eventually produced enough pressure to change the official designation. The dream of bringing Fishman Island to the surface, of finally moving the kingdom up into the sunlight, was a dream that had been alive in the hearts of the fish folk for generations, connected in ways they could feel but not fully articulate to a promise that had been made and broken 800 years before. Ancient sea kings remembered Joy Boy. In their long, slow way of knowing things, which operated across decades rather than moments, they held the memory of the person who had worked alongside Poseidon to try to raise Noah, who had failed, who had promised that someone would come. The Sea Kings were patient in the way of things that have no concept of being in a hurry. They would wait. They had been waiting for 800 years. They would keep waiting until the conditions were right and the person they were waiting for arrived. Wano closed its borders somewhere in this long middle period of history, though the specific moment and the specific reasoning are wrapped in the same deliberate opacity that surrounds everything connected to the Kozuki clan. What can be reconstructed is the pattern. The Kozuki family were the world's most dangerous record keepers, the only people capable of reading what was written on the poneglyphs, the one group whose complete knowledge made the world government's entire program of historical suppression vulnerable. Wano's isolation was the response, not simply a political decision about trade or sovereignty, but a necessity born of the understanding that the knowledge the Kozuki clan held was the kind that got islands destroyed. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. 400 years before the present day, a man from the kingdom of Lavneal in the North Blue undertook a voyage that he recorded with the particular care of someone who understood that what he was seeing was remarkable, and that careful documentation was the only way to make it believable. His name was Mont Blanc Noland, and he was a botanist and an explorer, the kind of person who collected plant specimens and wrote down precise measurements and tried to understand the natural world through the accumulation of observed detail rather than through legend or assumption. What Noland found when he arrived on the island of Jaya in the year 1120 by the Sea Circle calendar was something that his training as a botanist had not prepared him for. He found a golden city. Among the tropical humidity and the dense jungle and the insect chorus of an equatorial island, there were golden towers that caught the morning light and held it in a way that made the surrounding jungle look ordinary by comparison. The city was alive. People moved through its streets. Warriors stood at its edges. The sound of a great bell hung in the air above everything, a tone so deep and so resonant that it seemed to come not from the bell itself, but from the earth beneath it. The people of Shandora, descended over 1,000 years from the original guardians of the poneglyph, adapted to their island and their jungle and their purpose, were in the middle of a crisis when Noland arrived. A disease was moving through the community. People were dying in ways that the Shandoran warriors and healers could not fight with any technique they possessed. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years was being taken apart from within, one person at a time, by something invisible and relentless. Noland understood what the disease was. His training in botany and his experience with tropical ecosystems gave him a framework for what was happening that none of the Shandorans had access to. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because the specific knowledge needed to identify the source of this particular illness had been accumulated in distant kingdoms that the Shandorans had never visited. Noland set to work immediately. He did not negotiate, he did not establish conditions, he did not wait to be invited or thanked. He simply brought everything he knew to bear on the problem and began working toward a cure, because that was what needed to be done. The Shandoran chief Kalgara watched this stranger arrive and begin working on the sickness that was killing his people with an initial wariness that was entirely reasonable, given the circumstances. Strangers who arrived uninvited at Shandora and began making demands, even the demand to help, were not automatically welcome. But as the disease began to retreat, as people who had been dying began to recover, something shifted between Kalgara and Noland. The two men, separated by language and culture and everything about their circumstances, found in each other a quality that crosses all distances. They found sincerity. Noland was genuinely trying to help. Kalgara genuinely appreciated it. A friendship formed in the space where suspicion had been. When Noland prepared to leave Jaya, he did something that seemed to him entirely necessary and even kind, and that Kalgara experienced as a devastating act of desecration. Noland had identified, in the course of treating the disease, that a grove of trees being used in Shandoran religious practice was connected to the biological source of the illness. He cut the trees down, not thoughtlessly, not carelessly, but with a purpose that he understood and that he did not adequately explain before acting. To Noland, removing the trees was the final step in ensuring the disease would not return. To Kalgara, returning from a hunt to find the sacred trees gone, the trees connected to the graves of his ancestors, the trees that were the physical anchor of his community's most important spiritual practices, was an act of unforgivable violation by a man he had called a friend. Noland returned to Louvneil and wrote his account of the journey with the full faith of someone who had done genuine good and seen genuine wonders. He described the golden city of Shandora in specific, reverent detail. He brought his king back with him on a second voyage, promising to show him everything he had described. But when the ships arrived at Jaya, Shandora was gone. The geological event that had launched Shandora skyward had occurred in the time between Noland's first and second visits. There was nothing on Jaya but jungle and the memory of towers that no one else had seen. Noland was publicly disgraced. He was tried for lying to the king of Louvneil and executed, and the story of his logbook became a children's tale told across the North Blue. The story of a foolish liar called Usulland, who had made up a story about a golden city because he wanted to seem important. Kalgara, who had eventually learned from a visiting crew the truth about why the trees had been cut, had spent years sailing in search of Noland to make his apology, carrying the weight of having misjudged a man who had saved his people. He never found him. He died searching, and in Shandora, which was by then floating in the clouds above the ocean and aging into the ruin that the Straw Hats would eventually find, the Shandorans kept their drums and their bell and their vigil, and every day at a certain hour they rang the drums of liberation, in the hope that the sound would carry down through the atmosphere and across the sea and somehow reach the man they were grateful to. The Noland family in Louvneil kept the logbook. It was treated as a document of humiliation. the testimony of a liar that was preserved precisely because it was useful as a cautionary story about the consequences of false claims made to kings. The boy who eventually found the logbook in the possession of a distant descendant was a young man in the East Blue who would call himself Usopp, who would one day stand in the golden ruins of Shandora and understand, with a clarity that no one had allowed for in centuries, that his ancestor had been telling the truth the entire time. The world continued its long reshaping in the centuries between Nolan's era and the present. Pirate crews rose and fell. The world government consolidated its authority over more and more of the world's kingdoms, using the warlord system to contain the most powerful pirates, using the Marines to enforce law in the Four Blues and in the first half of the Grand Line, and watching the New World with the particular wariness of an authority that knows its power has limits. The Seven Warlords of the Sea, that arrangement by which particularly powerful pirates were offered official recognition in exchange for cooperation, was a system born of realism rather than principle. The world government could not eliminate piracy. It chose to control it instead. The figure of Im, later and more correctly referred to as Imu, sat on the empty throne at the heart of Mariwa, though no one outside the innermost circle of the world government officially acknowledged this. The empty throne was supposed to symbolize the shared authority of the 20 founding families, the principle that no single ruler sat above all others. In practice, it had always held someone. Imu's existence and Imu's nature and Imu's specific power would not become clear to the wider world until the events of Egghead Island forced several centuries' worth of concealment into the open at once. But Imu had been present for a very long time, had been watching the world for a very long time, and had been making decisions that shaped the course of history in ways that no official record would ever attribute to any single person. The five elders, the Gorosei, existed as the administrative layer between Imu and the rest of the world government. 5 men, each carrying a title, each possessing capabilities that placed them well beyond ordinary human limits, each serving the same master and the same program with a consistency that had remained unbroken for centuries. The Gorosei were not simply advisors or administrators in the ordinary governmental sense. They were agents of a specific and deeply considered worldview, and the actions they took in the present era, including the direct deployment to Egghead Island, were expressions of a commitment that had been maintained through every change of Marine Admiral, every warlord granted or revoked, every buster call authorized for as long as any of them could remember. Roughly 38 years before the present day, an event occurred at a place called God Valley that represents one of the most significant military engagements in the recent history of the One Piece world, and that the world government has spent every day since working to ensure that no one knows about. God Valley was a real location, an island that existed on a specific set of coordinates that had a name and a geography and a population, including a number of slaves who were being held there by celestial dragons who had come for what they understood as a kind of sport. The island no longer appears on any map. Its name does not appear in any official marine historical record. From the world government's perspective, God Valley never existed. On that island, at some point 38 years before the present day, a pirate named Rox D. Zebek had assembled the most dangerous collection of individual fighters that the world had ever seen in a single crew. The Rox pirates were not simply a strong crew in the ordinary sense. They were a roster of people, each of whom would independently, in the years and decades that followed, reshape the world in their own right. Kaido was there, the man who would become one of the 4 emperors, who would occupy Wano for 20 years, who would endure every attempt to kill him and claim in his dark moments that it was not toughness, but simply the inability to die. Charlotte Linlin was there, the woman who would become Big Mom, who would build an empire in Tato Land and raise dozens of children as the core of her military organization, who would become one of the most terrifying powers in the New World. And Edward Newgate was there, Whitebeard, who would become known as the strongest man in the world, who would declare the oceans his territory, and call his crewmates his sons. Rox D. Zebek wanted something that went beyond the Pirate King. He wanted to be king of the world in a more literal sense, above the world government, above every existing structure of authority, the single most powerful person on the planet by default rather than by legend. He was a man whose ambition had no ceiling and whose methods had no floor. The world government responded to the threat he represented at God Valley with an action they have never officially acknowledged. They allied with Gol D. Roger, the pirate who would later become the Pirate King, joined forces with the Marine hero, Monkey D. Garp, Luffy's grandfather, and together they fought the Rox pirates and defeated them. Rox himself died at God Valley. The crew disbanded. The island was wiped from the map. The alliance at God Valley was the kind of thing the world government could not permit to be known, because it demonstrated something inconvenient, that even the Marine hero and the greatest pirate alive had needed each other to stop something that the full force of the world government alone could not handle. It suggested a vulnerability. It suggested that the structures of authority that the world government had built were not quite as absolute as it needed everyone to believe. And so God Valley ceased to exist. The event was classified, sealed, and buried in the deepest part of the Marines' institutional memory. Gol D. Roger did not form his pirate crew as a response to God Valley or as a direct continuation of that alliance. His path had its own logic, its own rhythm, its own internal drive that was connected to something more personal than geopolitics. Roger possessed the voice of all things, a rare ability unexplained by any ordinary framework of devil fruits or hockey that allowed him to hear messages not audible to ordinary senses. He could hear what was written in the poneglyphs without learning the Kozuki script. He could hear the Sea Kings. He could hear, in some way that he never fully articulated to anyone but his first mate, Silvers Rayleigh, the voice of a world that was speaking a truth that almost no one else could receive. The Roger pirates, over the course of their voyages, gathered information the way a person gathers a picture from scattered pieces, one fragment at a time, each one making the larger image slightly clearer, until the day came when they had enough. The 4 road poneglyphs were required to calculate the route to Laughtail. Roger and his crew located and read each of them over the course of their time in the Grand Line, and in doing so assembled a map that had not been assembled since Joy Boy's era. The addition of Kozuki Odin to the Roger pirates was not a simple transaction. Odin was the son of the Wano shogun, a man of extraordinary physical presence, famous for fighting with 2 blades simultaneously, who had defied the expectations of Wano's rigid society at every turn by simply being too large, in every sense, to fit inside the boxes that society tried to put him in. He had sailed with Whitebeard first, absorbing everything that the New World had to teach him, before encountering Roger's crew at sea and transferring to them in a moment of mutual recognition. Odin could read the Kozuki script. He was, in the present era, the last person who could. And what that meant was that with Odin aboard the Roger pirates had access not just to the sounds that Roger could hear, but to the precise meaning of the words that had been carved into the poneglyphs by his own ancestors. Together, the Roger pirates made it to Laughtail. They gathered the 4 road poneglyphs, calculated the route, sailed to the end of the Grand Line, and arrived at an island that the world had been pretending did not exist. Roger learned everything. He laughed so hard and for so long that the laughter became the name of the island itself. Whatever Joy Boy had left there, whatever the One Piece actually was, whatever the full truth of the Void Century turned out to be when laid out in its entirety, filled Roger with something that he could only express through that particular laughter. Not the laughter of someone finding a joke amusing, the laughter of someone who has finally understood a thing they have been working toward for years, who sees how it all connects, who recognizes in the punchline of a long story the shape of something that was always going to come out this way. Roger understood Joy Boy. He felt, he said later, that he had been born in the wrong era. that he had arrived at the truth too early to be the one who acted on it. Roger knew he was dying before the voyage to Laugh-Tale, a disease, one that Crocus, the best doctor available, could not treat, had been working through his body for some time. He had managed it across the final years of his voyages, refusing to let it slow the pace of his search, but it was advanced enough that he understood the end was a matter of time rather than possibility. With Laugh-Tale behind him, with the truth known and the One Piece discovered, and the full scope of Joy Boy's promise understood, Roger made a decision about what to do with the time remaining. He turned himself in. He traveled to Logetown, the city in the East Blue where he had been born, and he surrendered to the Marines. The world government, eager to demonstrate the extent of its authority by executing the Pirate King publicly, arranged his death on a scaffold in the Central Plaza. The crowd that assembled to watch was enormous. They had come from all over the East Blue and beyond, some of them hoping to see the end of an era, some of them secretly grieving it, most of them simply drawn by the gravity of a moment that would not come again. Roger stood on the scaffold without visible fear and spoke to them all. He told them that his treasure was real. He told them that the One Piece was out there. He told them with a directness so simple that it cut through every layer of official narrative and political framing, that if any of them wanted it, they could go and find it. Then he died, and the great pirate era began. The idea Roger planted in the hearts of 20,000 witnesses that morning could not be executed alongside him. People who had never considered sailing beyond the next island suddenly felt the pull of the horizon. The seas filled with people who could not fully articulate why they were going, but who could not stop going. Some of them wanted the treasure. Some of them wanted the freedom. Some of them wanted to be the one who found what Roger had found, who understood what Roger had understood, who stood on that same island and laughed the same laugh. The Great Pirate Era was not a policy or an edict or a deliberate cultural movement. It was simply what happened when a man told the truth in a loud enough voice. In the East Blue, in a village called Fuchsia on the Island of Dawn, a child was born not long after Roger's execution, whose existence would prove to be the most important development in the entire span of history we have been tracing tonight. His name, when it was given to him, was Monkey D. Luffy. He was born into a family that carried enormous weight without ever being entirely visible. His grandfather was Monkey D. Garp, the Marine Vice Admiral, the man who had fought alongside Roger at God Valley and who was widely considered the most powerful individual in the entire Marine organization, despite having declined every promotion to Admiral that had ever been offered to him. His father, a fact that Luffy would not know for many years, was Monkey D. Dragon, the most wanted criminal in the world, the leader of the Revolutionary Army, a man who had looked at the world government's structure and decided it needed to be fundamentally dismantled. Luffy himself was none of these things yet. He was a child, small, round-eyed, entirely unconcerned with politics or history or the weight of the world, who had decided, with the particular directness of a child who has not yet learned to doubt himself, that he was going to be the Pirate King. He had decided this before he had any clear idea what the Pirate King was, or what the title had cost the person who last held it. It was a goal that required no justification for him. It was simply the thing he was going to do. When Luffy was 7 years old, a pirate crew arrived in Fuchsia Village and remained for several weeks. The captain was a young red-haired man named Shanks, who moved through the world with the ease of someone who has stopped worrying about the impression he makes, who laughed often and at the right moments, who was already carrying the quality of presence that would eventually define him as one of the 4 emperors, even though he was not yet that at the time. Shanks and his crew settled into the village's single bar with the casual comfort of people who are used to making any place a temporary home. And Luffy, with the specific determination of a child who has decided someone is interesting, attached himself to them immediately. Luffy wanted to join the crew. Shanks refused, gently and repeatedly. Luffy was too young, too small, and, most critically, unable to swim. In a world where the ocean is the primary landscape and devil fruit users are automatically incapable of swimming, being unable to swim before eating a devil fruit was a different kind of vulnerability. Shanks told him to get stronger, to train, to wait until he was genuinely ready. Luffy heard this as a reasonable challenge rather than a discouraging rejection, because that is the specific way in which Luffy processes obstacles. During the same period, Luffy ate a devil fruit. It was the gum gum fruit, or as the world would learn much later, the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, the most significant devil fruit in the entire history of the One Piece world. The fruit that Joy Boy had eaten 900 years before, the fruit that the world government had been hunting for 8 centuries under its classified designation as the gum gum fruit, specifically to prevent anyone from understanding what it actually was. The world government had been hiding the true nature of this fruit for so long that even the people assigned to hunt it did not know its real name or real power. It had been sitting in a chest on a ship in the harbor of a village in the East Blue, as ordinary looking as any other devil fruit, waiting for the person who would eat it. Luffy ate it because he was hungry and it was in front of him. He did not understand what it was. He did not know that he was reaching across 900 years of history and picking up where Joy Boy had left off. He was simply a 7-year-old boy making an impulsive decision in the way that 7-year-olds do. But the fruit was real, and the transformation was immediate. His body became rubber, permanently, irreversibly elastic, stretching and absorbing impact in ways that would eventually make him nearly impossible to harm through ordinary means, while also making him permanently incapable of swimming, permanently vulnerable to the sea itself. Shanks stayed in Fuchsia Village long enough to save Luffy's life, when a sea monster that Luffy had provoked caught him and pulled him towards certain death. In saving him, Shanks lost his arm. Not in a battle for territory or pride or political advantage. In saving a child from consequences the child had brought entirely upon himself. He paid for Luffy's impulsiveness with a part of his body that could not be replaced, and he did this without apparent regret, smiling because Luffy was alive, and that was the only part that mattered. Before leaving Fuchsia Village for the last time, Shanks took the straw hat from his own head and placed it on Luffy's. He told Luffy to return it when he had become a great pirate. Luffy took the hat. He has not removed it since. Luffy grew up in Fuchsia, knowing 2 other children who would become, in different ways, defining presences in his life. The first was Portgas Diaz, the biological son of Gol D. Roger himself, born after Roger's death, to a woman named Rouge who had extended her pregnancy for 20 months through sheer determination, ensuring that her child would be born after the Marines had stopped looking for Roger's heir. Ace carried his mother's family name rather than his father's. He was raised by Monkey D. Garp in the remote wilderness of the Goa Kingdom's mountain ranges, alongside Luffy, who was his brother in every way that mattered, despite no shared blood. Ace was older and stronger, and carried within him a pride that was complicated by the specific burden of knowing who his father was. A man whose legacy Ace had grown up resenting because it meant his own existence was the product of something the world had already decided to execute. The second was Sabo, a noble's son who had run away from his aristocratic family in Goa Kingdom rather than live inside the gilded cage of Hightown. Sabo had walked through the gray terminal, the enormous dumping ground, where the city's poor and forgotten lived among the refuse of the wealthy above, and had chosen that honest deprivation over the dishonest comfort of his family's mansion. He found Ace and Luffy on the mountain and became a brother to both of them, the thoughtful one of the 3, the one who looked further ahead than the other. 2. The one who understood why what they were dreaming about mattered beyond the simple adventure of it. The 3 brothers made a pact. They drank to it in the way of old pirate stories, with cups of sake that none of them were old enough to have legally obtained, and they promised each other that they would all become great pirates, that they would never let anything stop them, that the ocean was their future, and the future was something to sail toward rather than fear. The pact carried within it the particular weight of promises made by children who mean them completely without yet understanding the full cost of keeping them. Sabo appeared to die in a tragedy connected to the corruption of Goa Kingdom's nobility, a tragedy in which the Grey Terminal was burned to clear it before a royal visit, and in which Sabo's own small sailing boat was fired upon by a world government ship at the same time. To Luffy and Ace, Sabo was gone. The grief of that loss was real, and it stayed with Luffy in the specific way that grief stays with people who don't know how to put it down, not constantly occupying the surface of his thoughts, but present underneath everything, a weight that shaped how he held on to the people he loved. What Luffy did not know, what Ace did not know, was that Sabo had been found barely alive by Monkey D. Dragon, and brought into the Revolutionary Army, where he grew up among the people who were most directly opposed to the world government that had tried to kill him. Luffy trained in the wilderness of Goa Kingdom after Shanks left, and Sabo disappeared, accumulating in himself the particular kind of endurance that only years of deliberate hardship can produce. He was thrown into environments that should have killed him, which they would have if he had not been made of rubber, and he came out of each one more capable than when he went in. He was not a careful or systematic student of technique. He learned by surviving, by pushing against things until they gave, by refusing to conclude that a problem was impossible simply because it had not yet been solved. When he was 17, he set out from Fuchsia village in a barrel, floating into the open ocean with his straw hat on his head and nothing else to guide him but the direction he had decided to go. The East Blue is the weakest of the four seas. Its pirates carry modest bounties by Grand Line standards. Its storms are manageable. Its mysteries are smaller and closer to the surface than what waits in the second half of the Grand Line. For someone preparing to sail to the end of the world, beginning in the East Blue is the equivalent of learning to walk before attempting a mountain. But the East Blue gave Luffy everything he needed to start, the specific people whose strengths fit precisely around the shape of his weaknesses, the crew that would define the Straw Hat Pirates for the entire world. That came after. Roronoa Zoro was the first. He was being held captive in a marine base, tied to a post in the courtyard as a public demonstration of the Marine's authority. Having been given the choice between submission and execution, and having chosen a third option that was not offered to him, simply waiting, without submitting, without dying, because neither submission nor death was acceptable. Zoro had a goal of his own that was older than anything Luffy represented to him. He had promised a childhood friend named Kuina, who had died young, that one of the two of them would become the greatest swordsman in the world. She had died before either of them could prove themselves, and Zoro had made her death into the fuel of his ambition. He would carry both of their dreams and make them real in his own name. The greatest swordsman in the world. That was the title he was going to take. Luffy saw in Zoro something he recognized in himself, the kind of will that doesn't negotiate with its limitations. He cut Zoro's ropes and asked him to join the crew. Zoro agreed, on the condition that when the time came, Luffy would support his ambition the same way that Zoro would support Luffy's. That agreement, simple, direct, mutual, became the foundation of the Straw Hat Pirates' internal order. Not hierarchy in the strict sense, not command and subordination, but a set of individual dreams held alongside each other, each one respected and supported by the others. Nami joined in a village called Kokoyasi, on an island under the occupation of a fisherman pirate named Arlong. Nami's story was one of the most quietly painful in the East Blue. She had been working for Arlong, not from loyalty or ideology, but from a deal she was desperately trying to complete. A promise that if she raised 100 million berries, Arlong would release her village from his control. She had been stealing from pirates and merchants for years, accumulating treasure, getting closer each time, and each time having the money seized by a corrupt marine captain named Nizumi, who was in Arlong's pocket. Resetting her progress and extending the timeline of her servitude indefinitely. She had done this for years in silence, because asking for help might cost her the fragile arrangement she was still working within. Luffy did not understand all of the details when he fought Arlong. He did not need to. He could see Nami crying, and he understood that she had been crying for a long time, and that she had been carrying something alone that she did not have to carry alone. He put his hat on her head. He walked into Arlong Park and destroyed it. The Marine captain who had been accepting bribes was reported and dealt with, and Nami, free for the first time in years, asked if she could join the crew. He said yes. Usopp joined at Syrup Village, a boy whose father was one of Shanks's snipers, who had invented elaborate stories about pirates to give himself something to look forward to, who was frightened of almost everything, and chose in key moments to act anyway. Sanji joined at the Barati, the floating restaurant where he had been cooking for years under the explosive mentorship of a man named Zeph, who had once been a pirate himself and who had lost his leg giving Sanji a chance to survive when they were both stranded on a barren rock in the middle of the sea. Sanji's dream was the All Blue, a mythical ocean where the fish of all four seas gathered in one place, the ultimate expression of what cooking for people from every corner of the world actually meant. He joined because the ocean was calling, and the Straw Hat crew was the vessel worth joining. Their ship, the Going Merry, was small and unimpressive by Grand Line standards, and perfect for the East Blue. It was given to them by a girl named Kaya in gratitude for the protection they had offered against the pirate Kuro, who had spent years planning to steal her family's wealth under the disguise of a butler. The Going Merry would carry them through the East Blue and into the first half of the Grand Line, and eventually, after years of service and more damage than any ship should have been able to absorb, give them one last act of love before it sank. They entered the Grand Line through Reverse Mountain and descended into a world that operated by entirely different rules than the East Blue. Their first encounter was with Laboon, the giant whale who had been ramming himself against the Red Line for 50 years, waiting for a crew that had promised to return for him and had never come. Crocus, the lighthouse keeper, had been watching over Laboon and trying to prevent the whale from injuring himself further, because Crocus had known the crew that made the promise and understood that they were not coming back. Luffy made his own deal with Laboon, a battle, with a rematch promised at the end of the Grand Line. He drew a mark on Laboon's head with paint. This made Laboon stop ramming the Red Line. It gave him something to look forward to. And it gave the Straw Hats their first lesson about the Grand Line's emotional texture. This was a sea full of long waitings and unfinished promises, and the specific kind of hope that persists even when the rational case for it has been exhausted. The Grand Line's early islands offered their own specific education. Whiskey Peak appeared to be a welcoming port town with enthusiastic residents, a lie that peeled back to reveal an island full of bounty hunters working for the Baroque Works criminal organization run by Sir Crocodile. Little Garden was home to two giants named Dory and Brogy, who had been fighting a formal duel for 100 years over a question neither of them could any longer remember the original stakes of, bound by a code of honor that would not permit either of them to simply stop. The duel had consumed a century of their lives, and would have consumed more had the Straw Hats not arrived to create a disruption that paradoxically resolved the impasse. The giants were among the most significant encounters on the early Grand Line, not because of their power, but because of what their stories said about pride, about honor, about the way the noblest qualities of a culture can become their heaviest burden when taken to certain extremes. Drum Island brought Chopper, Tony Tony Chopper, the blue-nosed reindeer who had eaten the human fruit and gained the ability to communicate with humans, and who had spent his life rejected by both the animal world and the human one. His mentor, Dr. Hillaluk, had believed with every fiber of his being in the healing power of the Jolly Roger, had believed, until the last moment of his life, that a flag flown with enough sincerity could cure any disease. Chopper had absorbed that belief alongside every medical technique he had been taught, and when he eventually joined the Straw Hats, he brought both. He joined because Luffy asked him directly without qualifying the invitation or attaching conditions, and because being asked in that way, without reservation, without suspicion, without any of the thousand reasons that people usually offered for not being included, was something that Chopper had never experienced before. Alabasta was the arc that introduced the Baroque Works organization in full, exposed Crocodile's manipulation of the kingdom's civil war, and brought Robin into the story. The kingdom of Alabasta was in crisis, a drought that had persisted for years. A government blamed for it, a resistance movement convinced it had been betrayed, and a pirate behind everything who wanted access to the ancient weapon Pluton, which he believed was hidden beneath the kingdom's sand. Crocodile had spent years engineering this situation with patience and intelligence, and by the time the Straw Hats arrived, the fuse was lit, and the only question was whether anyone could pull it back before the explosion. Luffy fought Crocodile 3 times. The first 2 attempts ended in near death. The third fought in the underground temple where Crocodile had cornered both the Straw Hat captain and the kingdom's Princess Vivi. Ended differently. Ended with Luffy doing something that nothing about the fight's logic suggested should have worked, which is to say that Luffy found the specific angle of approach that was invisible from every reasonable position and hit Crocodile through the floor of the room with enough force to send him through the ceiling. The victory was narrow, personal, and entirely consistent with how Luffy solves every problem, by refusing to accept that the version of impossible he's been presented with is the only version of impossible available. Robin, who had been Crocodile's second in command under the name Miss All Sunday, made her decision in the aftermath. She had spent 20 years running. From the world government, from anyone who represented authority, from anyone who knew her name and what the world government wanted done with it. She had survived by being useful to dangerous people, by making herself indispensable as the only person alive who could read poneglyphs, while never belonging anywhere or trusting anyone with the truth of who she was. She asked to join Luffy's crew on the marine ship they had commandeered, framing it as something she had decided unilaterally rather than something she was asking permission for. Luffy said yes. She stayed. Skypiea came next, the arc that answered what had happened to Shandora. The Straw Hats followed a skyfish to a sea cloud and rode an ocean current upward into the upper atmosphere, arriving at a civilization 5,000 meters above the sea that had its own political history, its own crisis, and its own connection to the story of Noland and the bells that had gone silent 400 years before. The god of Skypiea was a man named Enel, who had eaten the Rumble Rumble fruit and acquired the power of lightning, and who had decided from this that he was literally divine and that Skypiea's population existed at his pleasure. Luffy's rubber body made him the only person on the island capable of fighting Enel without being killed instantly, which was convenient for the population and entirely typical of the way Luffy's specific qualities tend to fit precisely the problems he's asked to solve. When the battle was over and Enel had been sent to the moon on his golden ark, Robin found the poneglyph in the ruins of Shandora. She read it quietly. She said nothing about what it contained to anyone who was watching. But the truth of what the Kazuki family had carved into that stone, the specific message that the Shandorans had been guarding for 1,000 years, had reached the person it was meant to reach. The poneglyph held information about Pluton, as Nico Robin would not reveal until the events of Wano decades later. And when the great bell finally rang above Shandora, when its tone rolled out across the clouds and downward through the atmosphere toward an ocean that could not hear it, but that contained somewhere in its depths a descendant of Kalgara who had spent his life being told his ancestor was a liar. Something about the world felt, very slightly, more whole. Water 7 was where the journey turned. The Straw Hats arrived needing their ship repaired. The Going Merry had been damaged across 2 years of grand lines sailing into a state that even the most gifted shipwright could not reverse. The ship's keel was cracked beyond repair, its structural integrity gone in the specific way that means a ship has given everything it has and has nothing left to give. Tom's workers, the legendary shipbuilding firm of Water 7, had built Gol D Rogers' ship. The shipwright who met the Straw Hats was Frankie, a man of mechanical genius who had rebuilt most of his own body after a catastrophic accident, replacing flesh with iron, and cleverness and a particular kind of pride in what the human body could become when it stopped apologizing for itself. Frankie assessed the Going Merry and told them the truth. It needed to be put to rest. The Cypher Paul 9, the world government's elite covert unit, was already in Water 7 with a mission connected to the ancient weapon Pluton. The blueprints for Pluton had been held for generations by the descendants of Tom, the shipwright who had built Roger's vessel. CP9 wanted those blueprints. They also had secondary orders relating to Robin, whose ability to read poneglyphs made her a target that the world government had never stopped wanting eliminated. The events at Water 7 moved quickly and confusingly. Accusations of assassination, the apparent death of a crewmate, Robin's disappearance, and a political situation designed to leave the Straw Hats isolated and uncertain. Robin had allowed herself to be taken. She believed, in the specific way of someone who has spent her whole life believing it, that her presence brought danger to the people around her, and that the most loving thing she could do was remove herself. The Straw Hats' response to this was the Enies Lobby assault, one of the most decisive acts in the entire first half of the One Piece story. Enies Lobby was the judicial island, the world government's processing center for high-priority prisoners, designed to be impenetrable, surrounded by a sky-high waterfall that dropped into a void, accessible only by a bridge miles long. The Straw Hats had no fleet, no plan that extended beyond the general principle of arriving and taking Robin back, and no legal standing whatsoever. They arrived in a sea train that they had commandeered and fought their way through hundreds of Marine soldiers to the building where Robin was being held. Luffy rang the island's bell during the battle, not because it was strategically useful, but because he wanted the sound to carry. He wanted the world to hear that the Straw Hat Pirates were there. He then had the world government's flag, the one that flew above Enies Lobby, burned. This was a declaration, not a polite one, not one accompanied by demands or conditions. Simply the act of burning the flag in the most visible way possible and letting the world interpret what that meant. It meant that the Straw Hat Pirates had decided that the world government's authority over Nico Robin was something they did not recognize, and that they were prepared to fight every marine and agent and force that the world government could send at them, rather than accept it. Robin was saved. The crew escaped. The Going Merry, damaged to the point of impossibility, made one final effort, carried them out of the chaos of Enies Lobby and through the battle and back towards safety in a last act of will that could not be explained by any ordinary engineering principle. When it finally stopped and could not continue, when the ship settled into the water and made clear that it had come as far as it was going to come, Luffy and his crew stood at the rails and wept. Not the brief crying of people trying to be done with grief quickly, but the sustained, full-throated weeping of people who have loved something and are watching it end. The Going Merry seemed to answer them in the particular way of the One Piece world, where ships possess something adjacent to a soul, with what read as a ship's version of gratitude. Frankie, who had watched all of this from the water, decided to build them a new ship. And then, because a ship needs a person who understands it to sail it properly, he joined the crew. Thriller Bark was the arc that brought the Straw Hats their 9th member and placed them in direct confrontation with one of the most philosophically interesting warlords in the system. Gecko Moria had been a genuinely powerful and ambitious pirate captain who had taken a crew into the New World and been met with a disaster so total and so personal that it had broken something in him. He lost his entire crew to Kaido. The Kaido who would occupy Wano, who would endure every attempt to kill or stop him, who embodied the terrifying possibility that some obstacles simply cannot be overcome by will alone. Moria survived the encounter by deciding that the only safe response was to never be vulnerable again, to replace human loyalty, which could be lost, with the loyalty of the dead, which could not refuse or fail or die on him a second time. He built Thriller Bark, the largest ship in the world, disguised as an island, crewed by animated corpses, commanded by a man who had decided that love was too expensive a fuel for ambition. Brooke was on Thriller Bark. He had been sailing the Florian Triangle alone for 50 years, a skeleton dressed like a musician, kept alive by the revive fruit that had brought him back from death once. His crew had all died, of illness, of grief, of the accumulated consequences of sailing a haunted sea alone after their captain had died, and then somehow returned. Brooke's goal was singular and had never changed in 50 years. He had promised Laboon at the entrance to the Grand Line that he would come back. He had been trying to find his way back ever since, to keep that promise, to be the one who did not leave Laboon waiting forever at the wall. When Luffy asked him to join the crew, with the same directness he had used with every other member, the same uncomplicated certainty that Brooke was someone he wanted. Brooke cried the tears of someone for whom the simple act of being asked was so far outside the ordinary texture of his existence that it required that particular response. Sabaudi Archipelago was where the Straw Hats first encountered the full weight of the world's highest tier of power and understood, precisely and without ambiguity, that they were not yet capable of operating at that level. The 11 supernovas were there, the rookie pirates of the current generation, each carrying a bounty over 100 million berries, each representing the newest wave of strength pushing into the Grand Line. Trafalgar Law, who moved with the particular calm of someone whose plans extend further ahead than the immediate situation. Eustace Kidd, whose ambition was broad and whose methods were direct. And others, each carrying their own histories and their own dreams, converging at the archipelago because it was the last stopping point before Fishman Island and the New World beyond. The incident that detonated the situation was a celestial dragon. A world noble was shot, or rather, one of Luffy's allies was shot by a world noble who had decided in the specific entitlement of someone who has never faced a consequence that he was allowed to do this. Luffy punched him. In the world of One Piece, this is the equivalent of declaring war on the entire institutional structure of the planet. Celestial dragons can summon an admiral simply by reporting that someone has been rude to them. Kizaru, the admiral who moved at the speed of light, who treated combat with a genial disinterest that was more frightening than rage would have been, arrived, and the Straw Hats discovered that the distance between them and a true Marine admiral was enormous. Bartholomew Kuma ended the battle by scattering them. One by one, he struck each member of the crew and sent them to distant locations across the world, away from Kizaru, away from the Celestial Dragon situation, away from certain death. He did this on orders from Dragon, who Kuma had connections with, and he did it with a specific care. Each crew member was sent to a location where they would be safe and where they could grow. It did not feel like mercy in the moment. Luffy arrived alone on Amazon Lily, home of the Kuja pirate empress Boa Hancock, and found himself separated from every person he had sailed with for 2 years, uncertain whether they were safe, certain only that he had failed to protect them. What followed was the fastest and most disorienting sequence of events in the entire One Piece timeline. Up to that point, news arrived from the outside world that Ace had been captured by Blackbeard, Marshal D. Teach, who had betrayed and killed his own crewmate to acquire the Darkness Devil Fruit, who had then turned Ace in to the government for the specific purpose of earning warlord status and access to Impel Down. Ace was to be publicly executed at Marine headquarters. The world government intended to use the execution of Roger's son as a demonstration of its authority over the pirate legacy, a final erasure of the lineage that had started the Great Pirate Era. Luffy's response was immediate. He went to Impel Down, the Marines' deep-sea maximum security prison, located beneath the ocean at the base of the Red Line, was designed to be completely inescapable. a series of descending levels, each more severe than the last, guarded by staff and systems specifically developed to prevent anyone with devil fruit powers from functioning effectively. Luffy went in anyway, alone in disguise, relying on Hancock's connections to get past the outer layers. He fought his way downward, sustaining damage that should have stopped him multiple times, fueled by the specific determination of someone who has defined success as getting to his brother and will not accept any alternative outcome as valid. He arrived too late. Ace had already been moved to the execution site. What Luffy found instead was a collection of prisoners, including some of the most dangerous people in the world, who were now available to be broken out in the chaos of his attempted extraction. The breakout included characters whose later appearances in the story would be significant, and it included Blackbeard himself, who used the chaos to achieve his own purpose, acquiring additional crewmates and escaping with them before anyone could stop him. Blackbeard. Teach had a specific plan for the historical long game. He had the darkness fruit, which gave him the ability to negate other devil fruit's powers in its vicinity. He knew, or suspected, that there was a way to take the powers of a dying devil fruit user, and he was building toward a confrontation with Whitebeard that would allow him to steal the most powerful paramecia fruit in the world, Marineford. The name is said with a particular weight in One Piece, the weight of something that marked a before and after. Edward Newgate, Whitebeard, brought his entire fleet to Marine headquarters to save Ace. Not because Ace was strategically valuable or politically important to him, but because Ace was his son in every way that mattered to Whitebeard, who had decided years ago that family was the thing worth building and protecting in a world where power was ultimately temporary. Whitebeard's fleet was enormous, and the individual power of the man himself, his Quake fruit, which allowed him to create vibrations that could affect even the ocean itself, was genuinely at the level described when people called him the strongest man in the world. The Marines had prepared for this. 3 admirals were present. Most of the active warlords had been summoned. The full resources of Marine headquarters were deployed. The entire battle was watched by the world through transponder snails, live broadcast, everything visible, the final confrontation between the old pirate order and the institutional authority that had been waiting for an opportunity to eliminate it. Luffy arrived in the middle of the battle, broken and exhausted, running on something that could not be precisely named in ordinary terms. He fought across the battlefield with a disregard for his own condition that suggested he had stopped keeping track of whether the things being done to him were survivable. He found Ace. The chains came off. For one moment, the worst of it seemed to be over. Akainu, the Marine admiral who operated from the conviction that absolute justice required absolute force, provoked Ace by speaking about Roger. He said something calculated to make Ace stop and turn around rather than keep running. Ace turned. He refused to leave the slight unanswered because Ace's pride was the specific kind that recognized the wrong moment to assert itself, but asserted itself anyway. Akainu's attack came. Ace stepped in front of Luffy to intercept it. Magna passed through Ace's body. Ace died on the battlefield with Luffy holding him. He said the things he had been unable to say for most of his life, that he was glad he had been born, that the years of uncertainty about whether his existence was something the world wanted had been answered by the people who loved him, that he had no regrets. He said thank you. He said it to Luffy and to all of them, quietly, without drama, the way someone speaks when they have arrived at the end of a long road and found that the road itself was worth traveling. And then he was gone. Whitebeard died after Ace. He faced the entire Marine force alone while his crew escaped, refusing every opportunity to retreat, struck by blows that would have ended any other person's life multiple times before the one that finally finished him. He died standing. He died speaking the same truth Roger had spoken, that the One Piece was real, that someone would find it, that the age of the sea was not over, but only becoming. He fell, and the last of the great old generation, the people who had known Roger personally, who had sailed the same seas in the same era, was gone. Shanks arrived and ended it. He positioned his ship between the armies and said, calmly and without theatrics, that enough had happened. No speech, no ultimatum, simply the presence of someone whose power was understood by everyone in the field offered as a boundary. The fighting stopped. Luffy was removed from the battlefield by Trafalgar Law's submarine. The world absorbed what had just occurred. Luffy's collapse after Marineford was not a matter of injuries, though the injuries were severe. He had broken in a deeper place, the place where a person carries the understanding that strength has limits, that will is not sufficient protection against everything, that the most important thing he had been sailing toward had been taken before he could reach it. He stayed on Amazon Lily in a state that moved between grief and its absence, unable to go forward, and unable to process the reasons for not going forward. Rayleigh came, Silver's Rayleigh, the first mate of the Roger pirates, the Dark King who had been at Laugh Tale and had understood what Roger understood. He did not offer comfort in the ordinary sense. He offered training. He told Luffy that there were things he needed to learn before he would be ready for the new world, and that 2 years was enough time to learn them. The 2 years of training are the axis around which the Straw Hat's whole trajectory turns. Luffy trained with Rayleigh on the island of Rusukaina, a place whose climate cycled through all 4 seasons in rapid succession, whose wildlife included creatures powerful enough to kill unprepared humans without effort, and whose isolation meant that Luffy could train without distraction at every level of intensity available. Rayleigh taught him the 3 applications of haki: armament, which allows the user to coat their body or weapons with a force that can harm even devil fruit users and give defense against attacks; observation, which extends the user's awareness beyond their physical senses into a field that can perceive the intent and presence of others; and conquerors, the rarest form, which radiates outward from the user's will and overwhelms the minds of those who encounter it. Luffy had used all 3 forms instinctively before this training, without knowing what they were. The 2 years were for understanding, for control, for building the capacity to use them deliberately rather than by accident. Each member of the crew grew in the place they had been sent. Zoro trained under Mihawk, the man who held the title Luffy had told him he would take, who received his new student with a minimal acknowledgement that the request was unusual, and began making it difficult immediately. Nami studied meteorology and weather generation on the Sky Island Weatheria, adding new tools to her navigation and combat capabilities. Usopp trained his body and his arsenal. Sanji spent his time on Kamabaka Kingdom, in a situation he described as deeply unpleasant and from which he emerged with physical capabilities he had not previously possessed. Frankie rebuilt himself further after encountering Vegapunk's research. Robin studied history and her own connections to the Revolutionary Army. Brooke toured the world as a famous musician, becoming a celebrity whose actual identity remained hidden beneath his stage persona. Chopper studied and developed new medical techniques, and when 2 years had passed, as if by agreement that needed no communication to maintain itself, they all returned to Sabaody at the same time. Fishman Island was the first stop in the New World, reached by descending through the ocean in a coating bubble applied to the ship. The island itself was one of the most beautiful places in the One Piece world, bioluminescent and enormous, carved into the rock at the base of the Red Line, full of light that fell in filtered columns from the surface far above. The crisis there was Hody Jones, a fishman whose ideology was built on hatred of humans, who had consumed enormous quantities of strength-enhancing pills in the service of a cause that he had never personally suffered for. Hody had not been hurt by humans. His parents had not been hurt by humans. His hatred was inherited from a culture of grievance, abstract and absolute, the kind that has no memory of its specific origin because it has been in circulation long enough to seem like a fact about the world rather than a choice. The deeper truth of Fishman Island was Shirahoshi, the mermaid princess. Gentle beyond anything her imprisonment had earned her was the living Poseidon, the the person born with the ability to call the ancient sea kings, the partner that Joy Boy had worked with 800 years before. She did not know this about herself. She had been kept in the tower at the center of Fishman Island since childhood, protected from a world her father feared would harm her if it knew what she carried. When the Sea Kings gathered in the ocean around Fishman Island during the confrontation with Noah, and when they explained what they remembered, that they had been waiting for this person, that the ancient promise was still incomplete, that the day Poseidon and Joy Boy's successor appeared together would be the day Noah finally served its purpose. The full shape of the story's structure became visible in a way it had not been before. Punk Hazard was the first island in the New World proper, a place of permanent destruction divided between extreme heat and extreme cold by the aftermath of a clash between two admirals years before, whose research facilities were being used by a scientist named Caesar Clown to produce weapons of mass destruction for the illegal arms trade and experimental drugs for Don Quixote do Flamingo. Trafalgar Law was waiting on Punk Hazard with a proposal. Law had a plan to bring down do Flamingo, not through direct force alone, which Law had assessed as beyond his current means, but through dismantling the infrastructure that made do Flamingo powerful. The Smile Factory, the sad production, the entire artificial devil fruit supply chain that had given Kaido his army of Zoan users. Law needed the Straw Hats to accomplish this, and he offered an alliance framed in terms of strategy rather than trust. Luffy agreed with the casual certainty of someone for whom alliances are simply another expression of who he is. Dressrosa was the heart of Doflamingo's operation and the most elaborate expression of his methodology. He had taken the kingdom through manipulation, dethroning the legitimate king and installing himself in the vacuum, then governing through a combination of absolute fear and the specific kind of loyalty that comes from making people dependent on your cruelty rather than protected by your kindness. The Smile Factory operated underground, turning people into animal power users through a process that carried a horrifying side effect. Anyone who ate a defective smile, a fraction of the total production, would lose the ability to express negative emotions. They would laugh. They would laugh through grief and pain and fear, condemned to wear expressions their hearts had no part in, because the fruit's failure had taken the full range of human feeling away from them. The Corrida Coliseum in Dressrosa brought back Sabo, alive, present, an officer in the Revolutionary Army, carrying 22 years of a life that Luffy had believed ended in fire and smoke when they were children. Sabo had no memory of his brothers for most of those years. The accident that should have killed him had destroyed the relevant memories, along with nearly everything else. He had rebuilt himself inside the Revolutionary Army without the specific weight of knowing what he had lost. But when news of Ace's death finally reached him, years later, the information arriving in a context that connected Ace's name to his own forgotten past, the memories came back, and with them the grief that should have been possible when it happened, and that came instead all at once, years delayed, and no less sharp for it. He came to Dressrosa. He took Ace's old weapon, the Flame Fruit, from the Colosseum's prize pool. He acted as Luffy's substitute in the tournament, and he was real, present, alive, in the world that Luffy had believed did not contain him. Luffy fought Doflamingo in the decisive battle of Dressrosa and Gear 4th, a new form developed during the 2 years of training, in which his rubber body was expanded and compressed and shaped into a figure of enormous striking power, bouncing constantly, faster and harder than anything he had done before. The battle was brutal and extended and required everything the form had available before it was finished. Doflamingo fell. The Smile Factory was destroyed. The sad production stopped. Kaido's army was disrupted at its source, and the people of Dressrosa, who had been living under Doflamingo's control for so long that the control itself had become invisible to them, were free. In the aftermath, something unexpected happened. The allies who had fought alongside the Straw Hats during Dressrosa, the disparate collection of pirates and warriors who had found their way into the battle for various reasons, declared their loyalty. Not to Dressrosa's cause. To Luffy, the Straw Hat Grand Fleet was formed. 7 crews, each pledging to answer when called, each representing a continuation of the connections made on that single island. Luffy accepted this with the same uncomplicated yes with which he accepted most things, not fully grasping the scale of what had just been organized in his name. Zoo was the Straw Hats' next significant destination, and arriving there meant arriving in the middle of a crisis that had already passed but left its damage visible everywhere. The Mink tribe, who had lived on Zunisha's back for 1,000 years in deliberate isolation from the world below, had been attacked by the beast pirates, specifically by a commander named Jack, who had come to Zoo looking for information about a samurai named Raizo. The Minks had protected Raizo. They had refused to give him up, even under extended bombardment and the deployment of a gas weapon that left the entire country unconscious. They had been systematically hurt for refusing to surrender someone they had decided to protect, and they had sustained that refusal without exception across the entire population. Raizo was there, hidden. He was a ninja from Wano, and his presence on Zoo was part of a plan that the 9 Red Scabbards, the retainers of Kazuki Oden, had been maintaining and preparing for years. The plan was to return to Wano and liberate it from Kaido and Orochi's control. The samurai needed allies. The Straw Hats were the allies Oden's retainers had been waiting for, whether they knew it or not. The story of what had happened in Wano came out gradually, told by the Scabbards and by Inuarashi and Nekomamushi, the leaders of the Mink tribe who had witnessed parts of it directly. 20 years before the present, Kazuki Oden had returned to Wano from his voyages with Roger and tried to open the country's borders. Oden had understood, had laughed tale, what Roger had understood, that the world was heading toward a specific moment, that someone needed to be in Wano to help it along when that moment came, and that Wano's borders being closed was an obstacle to the currents of history arriving when they needed to arrive. He had fought Kaido and Orochi for this principle, and he had lost, not through weakness alone, but through betrayal and manipulation. He had been captured, humiliated publicly, boiled alive in a pot in a final execution designed to be as degrading as possible. He had spent the full hour of his execution holding his retainers above the boiling liquid so that they could survive. He had died smiling. Whole Cake Island introduced the Straw Hats to the territory of Charlotte Linlin, Big Mom, one of the 4 emperors, who had built her empire in the New World through a combination of extraordinary personal power and the sheer organizational force of a family with dozens of children, each of them a commander in her military structure. Big Mom's territory was called Tatoland, and it operated on a specific political arrangement. Every citizen gave 1 month of their lifespan each year in exchange for the protection of residing there. The souls harvested through this arrangement were used to give life to the homies, the various objects and animals and constructs that populated Tato land and served Big Mom's administration. The Straw Hats had come to Whole Cake Island for Sanji to retrieve him from an arranged marriage to the Vinsmoke family's political alliance, a marriage that Sanji had not agreed to, but that his father Judge had engineered to serve the Germa Kingdom's ambitions. The Vinsmoke family, who were Sanji's biological relatives, despite his having spent most of his life in Zeph's restaurant and knowing nothing about them, had genetically modified their children for combat, all except Sanji, who had been judged a failure and treated as such throughout his childhood in ways that had marked him in specific and lasting ways. The arc resolved through a combination of Sanji choosing his own loyalty over his family's politics, and the Straw Hats escaping an alliance that Big Mom had intended to destroy at the wedding ceremony itself. Big Mom's own history was one of the most unusual in the New World. Born with an appetite beyond what any ordinary person could manage, given a devil fruit by a woman named Carmel who took care of the orphan children of giants, and who disappeared in circumstances that Big Mom herself could not explain. Linlin had grown into someone whose power was genuinely absolute within her territory, but who was also, beneath the surface, a woman whose emotional world was shaped by hungers and needs that ordinary political categories could not accommodate. The road poneglyph on Whole Cake Island was one of the 4 required to reach Laugh-Tale, and the Straw Hat's successful rubbing of it, carried out in the middle of everything else that was happening, brought them one step closer. Wano was where the full weight of everything that had been building arrived. The arc covered 2 primary timelines simultaneously. The present, in which the Straw Hats allied with the 9 Red Scabbards and various other forces to challenge Kaido on Onigashima, and the past, in which the story of Kozuki Oden, sailor, fighter, daimyo, dreamer, was told in the kind of detail that earned it a grief that extended beyond the specific characters, involved into something about what the world costs good people when they are too early for their moment. Odin had been extraordinary, not in the abstract way of legends, but in the specific, inconvenient, constantly getting into trouble way of someone who simply had more life in them than any available container could hold. He had been exiled from Wano by his own father for being too disruptive. He had joined the Whitebeard pirates because he physically forced his way onto their ship and refused to be removed. He had transferred to the Roger pirates with the same absolute confidence. He had been at Laugh-Tale. He had wept there because he understood that the moment the world needed had not yet come, that he was the right person, born in the wrong era, that his knowledge and his capabilities and his dream of opening Wano's borders were precisely what was needed, but precisely what the timeline could not yet accommodate. He returned to Wano and tried to do what he could within the time available. Kaido came. Orochi was already there, having worked his way into the shogunate through manipulation that Odin had not anticipated in time. The alliance between Kaido and Orochi produced a Wano that was unrecognizable from what it had been. A country stripped of its wealth and its dignity, its people working in factories under conditions that degraded them, its samurai culture suppressed, its best fighters either enslaved or dead. The raid on Onigashima brought together the largest alliance the Straw Hats had assembled to that point. The 9 Red Scabbards struck first, reaching Kaido and delivering injuries whose severity was enough to stagger even him. Kaido's own commanders fell one by one. Big Mom, who had come to Wano with her own intentions, was eventually dealt with by Law and Kid. The battle lasted the entire night, consuming the island from the top down as Luffy fought his way through layer after layer of opposition to reach Kaido at the summit. The 4 fights between Luffy and Kaido were each a different story. The first was a lesson. Kaido hit Luffy with his club before Luffy could fully engage, and Luffy woke up in a cell. The second ended with Luffy's apparent death. Kaido struck him in a way that stopped his heart, or seemed to, and Luffy's body went limp and began to fall. The devil fruit power flickered, something stopped, and then something else began. The Hito Hito no Mi, Model Nika, woke up, the full awakening of the fruit that Joy Boy had eaten 900 years before. The form that the world government had been preventing anyone from accessing for 8 centuries by calling it something else and hunting it with dedicated resources. It emerged in its complete expression for the first time in all of that time. Luffy became Gear 5th. His hair turned white, his eyes ringed with clouds. His body became something beyond rubber in the simple sense, something joyful in the specific way that the mythology described, something free in the precise sense of an entity that has stopped recognizing the rules of the physical world as mandatory. He laughed. The drum of liberation sounded across the sky. The clouds responded to the shape of his feeling. The fight with Kaido in Gear 5th was not a fight in the technical sense. It was a negotiation between 2 very different ideas about what power is for. Kaido's power was real and enormous, and built on a conviction that strength was the only truth worth acknowledging. Luffy's power was also real and enormous, built on a conviction that joy and freedom were indestructible precisely because they could not be contained or calculated. Luffy won. Kaido fell. The raid ended, and the long-awaited liberation of Wano, The liberation that Kozuki Oden had died for, that his retainers had crossed 20 years of time to deliver, was real. The five elders had been watching. The awakening of the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, was not merely a tactical development. It was the most significant event in their long program of world management since the original suppression of Joy Boy's era. The fruit had been in their possession and then lost, had been hunted for centuries, and had now awakened in full in someone who would not only use it, but survive to tell everyone what had happened. The world's newspapers carried the Battle of Wano. The broadcast went out. Luffy's new name, the Nika name, the Sun God name, the name the world government had been working for 800 years to ensure no one ever spoke in the context of the current era, was printed and distributed to every corner of the ocean. The aftermath of Wano reshaped the Yonko structure. Two of the four emperors, Kaido and Big Mom, had fallen in the same conflict. The vacuum this created was filled in the world's newspapers and in the political calculations of every power operating in the New World by two names, Monkey D. Luffy and Buggy the Clown. Buggy's elevation to emperor status was a result of the same escalating misunderstanding that had characterized his entire career, other people's projections onto him, his own bluster, and the specific way that the world sometimes generates legends from the material of comedy. Luffy's elevation was earned. His bounty reflected the new reality, the highest in the world, a number that communicated to everyone paying attention that the person most likely to reach Laugh-Tale was now in his late teens and sailing the New World. Egghead Island was Dr. Vegapunk's research facility, a place floating in the sky above the ocean, powered by technology that was years beyond anything available to the general population of the world. Vegapunk himself was the world's foremost scientific genius, a man who had spent decades working for the world government while quietly pursuing research that extended far beyond the scope of what the world government wanted him to know. He had 6 satellite bodies, versions of himself, each carrying a different dominant aspect of his personality. Atlas, the passionate one; Shaka, the logical one; Lilith, the impulsive one; Edison, the inventive one; Pythagoras, the systematic one; York, the greedy one, and the one who betrayed the rest of them, communicating with the celestial dragons in exchange for a position among them, offering access to Egghead's most sensitive research in the belief that what she would gain was worth what she was selling. The Straw Hats arrived at Egghead during the crisis that York's betrayal had created, and stayed through the arrival of the entire external pressure the world government could bring to bear. The 5 elders themselves came, not in the sense of sending agents or fleets, but personally, physically present on Egghead in their monstrous forms. The Gorosei were not simply administrators. They were ancient things, each one corresponding to a specific mythology, capable of transforming into forms that had no name in the ordinary taxonomy of the world. They came to ensure that Vegapunk did not distribute his research. Vegapunk had anticipated this. He had prepared a recorded message, a broadcast capable of traveling to every corner of the world simultaneously through Punk Records, the network that connected to transponder snails and speaking stone receivers across every sea. In the message, he told the world everything he had learned, that the ancient weapons were real, that the sea had risen 200 meters once before due to warfare at an ancient scale, that it would rise again if the same forces were set in motion, that the history the world government had suppressed was not simply the past, but the active operating system of the present political order. The revelation that the sea had previously risen was received differently in different parts of the world. In the revolutionary circles where people already believed the world government was built on concealment, it was confirmation. In ordinary households and merchant ships and marine barracks, it was confusion. In Kamabaka Queendom, where the revolutionaries processed the information most quickly, the connection was made clearly. The Void Century had not ended with the creation of the world government and the rise of the sea. It had created the conditions for a future repetition. The 4 bridges being built across the world's oceans, Tequila Wolf and its three counterparts, all named after alcohols, all under construction for 700 years, might be connected to the same forces that had divided the seas in the first place. Emeth moved on Egghead, the iron giant that Joy Boy's civilization had built 900 years before, that had been dormant for all of that time at the ocean floor, responded to something in the presence of the awakened Nika, whether the specific energy of the fruit, or the specific sound of the drum of liberation, or something else entirely, and began to move. It moved toward the Gorosei. Whether it succeeded in whatever Joy Boy had built it to do is a question that Egghead's chaos made difficult to answer clearly. But its reactivation was the most direct evidence available that Joy Boy's civilization had prepared for this specific moment, had built instruments that would respond to the return of the Nika Fruit's awakening, had thought further into the future than even the most optimistic reading of the evidence had suggested. Saturn, one of the five elders, the warrior god of science and defense, was destroyed. Not by the Straw Hats, by Emu. After Luffy's escape from Egghead was complete, after the situation had moved beyond the point where Saturn's presence served any additional purpose, Saturn was stripped of the immortality that made the Gorosei what they were. His title and his seat were given to Garling, the man who had overseen God Valley, who sat in Saturn's place and told the remaining elders that the world was heading into an unprecedented level of rebellion and that they needed to face it together. It was the first explicit statement of purpose from within the Gorosei's inner circle that had been audible to anyone outside it. Garling did not speak in euphemism about protecting history or maintaining order. He spoke about bettering the world. Whether that statement was honest, manipulative, or simply the language of someone who has been engaged in the same project for so long that he has lost the ability to see it from outside, is a question the present arc has not yet answered. The Thousand Sunny was captured after leaving Egghead and brought through something called the Sleeping Mists to Elbaf. 6 members of the crew were imprisoned inside a place called the Land of Gods, a part of Elbaf accessible to those with the specific authority to enter it, not accessible to those without. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji woke up outside this imprisonment and began navigating a world built for beings 30 times their size, with the same practical focus they bring to most obstacles. The first thing they encountered was a gluttony rabbit, a creature whose name suggested its nature, which they killed, cooked, and ate because the Straw Hats approached the world first by determining what they need to survive in the next few hours and handling that before anything more complicated. Elbaf itself is one of the oldest continuously inhabited locations in the One Piece world. The giants of Elbaf have been warriors and traders and record keepers across every era of the timeline, present at battles from the Void Century through the Roger era through the Marineford War. Dory and Brogy, the 2 giants who had been fighting their 100-year duel in Little Garden when the Straw Hats first encountered them, were famous across Elbaf. They had chosen their duel, accepted its consequences, and maintained it in the knowledge that their warrior culture required exactly this kind of commitment. When the Straw Hats reached Elbaf properly and were formally welcomed by the island's people, the reception included the specific warmth of a culture that had decided these particular small humans had earned the right to be guests. Loki, the giant prince, the heir to Elbaf's throne, was imprisoned within the Land of Gods, kept there by circumstances connected to the world government's interference in giant politics. Loki was enormous even by giant standards, and his story was tied to the God Valley incident and to the broader politics of Elbaf's relationship with the outside world. Luffy made a deal to free him. The arrangements were managed, the relevant people were subdued or appeased, and Loki was released. He introduced himself to the Straw Hats in the manner of a prince who has been waiting in a cage for a long time and has a great deal he has been waiting to say. The God Valley flashback that Loki is providing, the memory of what actually happened at the island that no longer appears on any map, is the lens through which the current events at Elbaf are being understood. God Valley's truth, whatever it fully contains, beyond what has already been revealed, is connected to the lineage of the giants, to the history of the celestial dragons, to the questions about Roger and Garp and rocks that have been circulating since the name God Valley was first mentioned. The present arc is in motion, and its full shape has not yet been disclosed. Shanks is at Elbaf, the red-haired man who gave Luffy his hat 20 years ago, in Fuchsia Village, who has been watching the world and making specific choices about when to act and when to wait, is on the same island where the Straw Hats have arrived. Shanks and Luffy have not yet properly met in the current timeline. The hat that Shanks gave Luffy has been on Luffy's head for his entire pirate. That return has not yet happened. It is still ahead, somewhere in the chapters not yet written. The reunion of Nico Robin with Jaguar D. Sol, the giant who saved her life on O'Hara 22 years ago. Who told her, as she ran toward the last boat, leaving the burning island, that someone would always be glad she was alive, who she had believed was dead since the Buster Call, was one of the quietest and most complete resolutions the arc has offered. Sol had survived. He had made his way to Elbaf in the years after O'Hara. He had been there, living among the giants who understood him, waiting not specifically for Robin, but living in a way that left him present for when she arrived. They reunited on Elbaf, and whatever Robin had been carrying for 22 years, the specific weight of surviving when everyone else did not, the debt of existence that Sol's last words had placed against an uncertain future, had its answering moment in the simple fact of his being alive. The timeline of One Piece, traced from that first tree planted on O'Hara 5,000 years ago to the events currently unfolding on Elbaf, is not simply a record of things that happened in sequence. It is a record of a promise made, partially kept, broken at the critical moment, and then maintained across 800 years by the stubborn insistence of people who refused to let it disappear. O'Hara's scholars burned, but one 8-year-old girl ran toward the water, and the world found her worthy of continuing. Shandora was silenced for 400 years, but the Shandorans never stopped ringing the drums of liberation, and eventually the bells rang again. Odin died in boiling water holding his retainers above the surface, but his retainers came forward in time and arrived in the present exactly when they were needed. Joy Boy broke his promise to Fishman Island, but he left the ship and the apology and the faith that someone would come. Every person in this story who mattered was carrying something forward for someone who came before them. Every island that stands in the present is doing so on the foundation of people who decided the island was worth standing on. Every sea that the Straw Hats have sailed has been full of that history, of memory and forgetting, and the specific determination of people who understood that some things are too important to be allowed to end. Luffy has 3 of the 4 road poneglyphs. The 4th is somewhere in the world, and the route to Laugh Tale is not yet complete, but it is closer than it has been since Roger's crew stood on that island and laughed. The Sea Kings are still waiting, patient in the way of ancient things, for the moment when Noah finally serves its purpose and the promise Joy Boy broke 800 years ago is answered by someone with the same fruit and a different era and a freedom that cannot be contained. The Straw Hat will come back, the drum will sound, and somewhere at the end of the Grand Line, on an island that can only be reached by someone who has gathered everything and sailed everything, and understood what the journey was actually about, the answer to a question 800 years old will finally arrive. The world is still waiting for it, the same way it has always been waiting across every sea. Thanks for spending this time sailing through the One Piece world with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.